that is shady. But every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy. The hollow earth, UFOs, aliens invading, fluoride in the water, this rare skies daily. When I talk about these things, they think I'm crazy. There's no escaping anymore, the evil that we're facing. Illuminati mind control, they're sacrificing babies. The end of days, but anyways, my family thinks I'm crazy.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And joining us today is an author unlike any other we've ever interviewed. He's been on the show once before, and I am so excited to have the doctor, the good doctor, Dr. Joseph Farrell, back on the show. You know him from his lengthy bibliography. He has published, on nearly every topic we've talked about on this show.
Can't hear you.
To encapsulate it all in one conversation. Last time you were on the show, we focused on your excellent book, The Vipers of Venice, how that book connects to Thrice Great Hermetica in the Janus Age, and some other things in between. You've been very busy since. There's 2 more new books out doing the intros. Dr. Farrell, welcome back. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to recently, and thanks.
Well, thanks for having me back, Mark. My family thinks I'm crazy too, so you're not alone. But I just had 2 new books come out. They were kind of a set. One is called The Rialto in Richmond, and the other is called The Rialto in Richmond Reconstructed, basically about the very end of the war between the states and then the early part of Reconstruction, because there's so many parallels to what's going on now. But other than that, I haven't really been up to that much, living and doing my shows and trying to keep the yard mowed and all of that.
Right on. Yeah, it's fascinating to see I think just the volatility of politics over the past 10 years. And with someone who's lived as much experience as you have, I'm sure you're seeing history repeat itself. So before we get into the topic we planned, what do you mean by that? How were the events of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, how are they sort of rhyming with today's events?
Well, in a couple of very basic, there's many ways, but I'll just mention 2 of them. Toward the end of the Civil War, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, fled Richmond. And the impression that we are given in school in this country when we study those events is that Jefferson Davis was this kind of loose cannon fanatic, and he was wandering around the Carolinas, and he's going to continue the fight into the last breath, and all of this nonsense, which, if you know anything about Jefferson Davis's character, that's about the farthest thing from what the man really was. But anyway, he was not a fanatical revolutionary by any stretch of the imagination. But what his flight from Richmond really was it was a continuity of government operation, because he carried with him and the little entourage that he had accompanying him, and the few soldiers, he carried with him the entire archives of the Confederacy. He was carrying a goodly amount of specie and currency, including English banknotes and so on and so forth. So, and in addition, the thing that really gives away what he was up to was he was carrying with him all of the great seals of the departments of the government of the Confederacy. So in other words, this was a continuity of government operations. So you have to really dig into that to understand all the strange events surrounding him and Mr. Lincoln's assassination, of course, and the events of the end of the war. The second parallel that I think is even more dramatic to today is the Civil War on both sides absolutely ballooned the debt of this country beyond anything that we had ever seen or experienced, and did so in a very, very short period of time. And the thing that occurred after the war was over was they were attempting to get the country back onto a metallic backing of the money in order to conduct international trade. And in that respect, it's worth noting the Confederacy was really in a much better position than the Union in terms of gaining foreign credit, because the Confederacy never abandoned the principle of backing its money. And of course, the Union, with the Lincoln Greenback, created a fiat currency that was debt free. So it was very difficult for the Union to get foreign credit during the war. In order to restore that credit, the Union had to go back on a metallic or a bullion backing of its currency. So it had to do one of two things. It either had to revalue the currency or deflate it. And of course, as we know from history, the post-war period of the country during Reconstruction, they chose the deflationary path, and they demonetized silver. And we know that the demonetization of silver was not accidental, nor was the policy of deflation, because the whole Comstock silver lode in Nevada had been discovered by that point, and its size and extent were well known. So the deflationary policy, which was so ruinous not only for the South but for many farmers in the Midwest as well, the deflationary policy was deliberately pursued. Then they were in league with this return to specie backing of the currency. There was a worldwide movement at that time to create a global currency based on currency pegs of national currencies to the French franc, which was itself a bullion backed currency. So there was a lot of stuff hovering in the background, and we're seeing these parallels play out today with state bullion depositories, and what I consider to be a scam of backing those state bullion depositories. And notice I say backing, with electronic transfer systems. That's the scam that they're playing now. So in other words, they're not pursuing the policy of deflation. What they're doing is revaluing the money so that they can claim that there's a little minute fleck of gold backing your currency. And because computers give us the ability to calculate that fleck of gold, we can pretend that we're backing your currency. Of course, we're not going to give you a fleck of gold should you take your little plastic card into our state bullion depository and demand the gold that's there for your card. This is the scam. So it's the old banker swindle. We'll give you a lot of nothing and you give us your hard assets. So there you go.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing to wrap your head around, and that's why it works so well.
Yep.
And yeah, I mean, to move into a system where things are even more intangible. I'm talking about the system of cryptocurrency. I'm sure you and I and many of the listeners are, if we really understood it the way you do, Dr. Farrell, we would move away from things like Cash App, Bitcoin, PayPal, Venmo.
Oh, I don't even call them cryptocurrencies. I call them kleptocurrencies, because the ultimate game here is to give you a bunch of electronic bits, a lot of nothing,
right,
in return for hard assets. And with Mr. Trump's sovereign wealth fund, and again, I'm not ragging on Mr. Trump. He's done a lot of good things. But the sovereign wealth fund idea, that as he's putting it into play, is one of the worst ideas that I've seen to come along in a long time.
right.
Because what it really is, it's a tender for, all the hard assets in possession of the federal government, not the least of which is all of its land in certain parts of the country. And in return for that, we're going to get a bunch of kleptocurrency. Well, I'm sorry, one nuclear airburst is going to wipe all that stuff out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So, I'm just not persuaded that this is the way to go.
Yeah. I think we share that position. And when it comes to Mr. Trump and his faction, it definitely felt like the propaganda reached a fever pitch. People were really rooting for him to drain the swamp and insert,
or hating him, and don't drain the swamp.
Exactly.
There's no pleasant middle ground here, which
Exactly.
is the big problem.
Well, but now with everything unfolding the way it has, the FBI coming out with this, I mean, asinine statement about the Epstein situation. It I wonder, what are you thinking, and how does this factor into what you talked about recently on your news and views? Because when we see these sort of extreme earth changes, things like tectonic plate activity, we're seeing
Mhm,
seismic activity in
mhm,
ways that naturally, there's a rhythm to these things, and when it falls outside of that spectrum of rhythm, makes you wonder. So yeah, how does Trump factor into what's going on in the global stage right now? Because it seems like, subversion, covert operations, things that can be written off as just an accident, this is the modus operandi nowadays with this
mhm.
political warfare.
Well, you've got several questions in there let's begin
Right.
at the beginning with Epstein. If there's nothing in the Epstein files, then Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced to prison for a whole lot of nothing, and needs to be let out immediately if there's nothing there. In other words, I think that the idea that there's nothing there is a big deflection. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many people in positions of power saying that there's nothing there. I mean, this is like the Warren report. Well, it was all a magic bullet. There's no conspiracy. So and repeat that often enough until you start to believe it. But more importantly, in terms of this administration on the geopolitical stage, there are so many things that have me puzzled about it and just downright frustrated about it because you can bring an end to this war in the Ukraine very quickly and very simply. Quit supplying them with weapons. And let me be very clear, I am four square on Russia's side of this conflict, because what the Ukraine was doing to the Russian citizens within its borders prior to Mr. Putin's military operation was absolutely unconscionable. And we're dealing with a regime which we ourselves initiated the coup to put into power over a previously elected, legitimately elected regime that wanted neutrality vis-a-vis Russia and Europe, which was the correct policy for the Ukraine. So, in other words, I think Mr. Trump can end the war very quickly, and that is just quit supplying that regime with weapons, and on top of that, insist that regime relinquish power, because you are dealing with a bunch of wartime banderists with that regime. People that were, quite frankly, in bed with the Nazis during World War II. That said, I am not one of these people that thinks that the Ukrainian people have no legitimate beef or historical grievances with Russia. If you've studied the history of the collectivization and resulting famine that resulted when the Soviet Union imposed that policy on the Ukraine. Nikita Khrushchev, for crying out loud, his nickname in the Ukraine was the Butcher of Kiev, because he was rounding up all the Ukrainian peasants and forcing them onto the collective farms, and if they didn't do that, off to the gulag you go. So yeah, there's bad blood there, and it's perfectly understandable. But Mr. Trump, the problem with Mr. Trump is I don't think that he has any awareness of these things nor sympathy with it. And on top of that, everything else on top of that, the United States and the United Kingdom have been meddling within the ecclesiastical politics of the Ukraine in a major way. And that doesn't even make our news over here, because, Americans don't think about that sort of stuff at all. But it's a huge part of the story as far as Russia and the Ukraine goes. So on and on it goes. And I, I'm a bit suspicious, Mark, about some of the things that we've seen going on back and forth, particularly this, and I think what you're alluding to with my news and views, is the earthquake that recently struck off of the Kamchatka Peninsula that was, I think, what, 8.8 on the Richter scale, which was an enormously powerful earthquake in a region of the world, and that particular region of Russia is very volcanically active. So this earthquake was touched off there and apparently relatively close to a Russian nuclear submarine base on Kamchatka Peninsula. And I'm very suspicious whenever I read about these earthquakes or tsunamis or hurricanes or tornadoes that appear in a context where there is geopolitical tension from the nation that is struck. I think there's a good and strong possibility that we might be looking at the use of just geophysical weapons in these types of contexts. Now, that's a faulty methodology in one way, in a significant way, in that we have no basis other than the context, the political or financial, oftentimes, context in which some of these events occur. So, in other words, what I'm suggesting, if you're suspicious about earthquake or geophysical weapons and their use, you have to look at the political or financial context in which an earthquake occurs. And if it occurs in those kinds of contexts, then the probability or the possibility that it is the actual use of a geophysical weapon increases. So my rule of thumb, to put a bit of history to this, my rule of thumb is that there are certain events in the world in the past, let's say 30 years, that suggest the possibility of geophysical weapons in use. Let's begin with the fall of the Soviet Union. If you go back to the period of time within 2 to 3 years of the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a massive earthquake in Soviet Georgia. And at the time, that earthquake was very, very devastating. And I think the possibility might be there because that earthquake did so much damage. I think it added to all of the economic and stability woes of the Soviet regime. And in addition, the Soviet foreign minister at the time was from Soviet Georgia. His name was Edvard Shevardnadze. So he was Mr. Gorbachev's foreign minister. So that's one possibility that I've always looked at. The other possibility in the same time frame was the earthquake, the devastating earthquake that hit Haiti during President Clinton's first administration. And if you'll recall at the time, and this is what I found very, very fishy and suspicious about that earthquake. And again, it was a very, very powerful earthquake. There were no reports whatsoever in the media of any aftershocks or tremors in the neighboring Dominican Republic. After all, Haiti and the Dominican Republic occupy the same island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. And there were no reports whatsoever. We heard nothing about what happened in the Dominican Republic during that earthquake. And I found that very, very suspicious. You'd expect to see at least something, windows were rattled, plates and dishes fell off the shelves or something about the Dominican Republic. But no, it was a big nothing. And I thought it suspicious at the time because at that time, Haiti was a hub not only for international money laundering, but it was a hub of all sorts of other, off the books activity, sex trafficking, arms trafficking and dealing, the whole 9 yards. Then within, I think, a week or two of the Haiti earthquake, you had a similarly sized earthquake hit Parral, Chile. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting because Parral, Chile is in the region of Chile that was home to the post-war neo-Nazi base called Colonia Dignidad, okay? And that was a center of child trafficking and weapons trafficking and so on and so forth. So you had what looked like to me a an earthquake possibility, an earthquake weapon possibly being used against Haiti, and then a responding earthquake weapon perhaps being used against a Nazi compound in a region of Chile well known for that type of activity. And the Farrell earthquake kind of put the seal on it for me, because at the time that that earthquake occurred, there were all sorts of massive tsunami warnings throughout the Pacific Ocean, including Hawaii. And by the time the tsunami hit Hawaii, the water rose very calmly about 3 feet, and that was it. And I thought, now wait a minute. If you have a magnitude 7 or whatever it was, if you have a magnitude 7 earthquake in Chile that's causing the potential for tsunamis all over the Pacific, and what hits Hawaii is a little bump in the road, then somebody had to have damped, and please hear what I'm saying now, somebody had to have damped all that energy to the point it was no longer a threat in Hawaii. So, in other words, the damping part of this story is another possible indicator that you had a geophysical technology being used in the first place. Then we had that tsunami in Indonesia, and this is my favorite one because this was the one that Catherine Austin Fitts pointed out to me, because she noticed a sudden sell-off of Indonesian sovereign bonds about a week prior to that incident. And she couldn't figure out why. There was no political, financial explanation for this sudden and dramatic sell-off of Indonesian sovereign securities. And then the tsunami hit, and she said, oh, that's what they were doing. So, in other words, that tsunami itself, in her opinion, was a geophysical technology in use, and somebody knew it was going to happen. Which, of course, if you've got that kind of technology and are planning to use it, you might do a little insider trading, to make a little money off the operation. So that's my explanation of this methodology in a nutshell. Because if you look at all of those events I've just outlined, there's some sort of financial or geopolitical event happening in the background. And the most famous one to me is the Fukushima incident of about a decade ago in Japan. Because what happened? Well, we had a new Japanese government that had just been elected and had taken power after years of liberal Democratic Party dominance in Japan. And that was a shocker in itself. And the first thing that new Japanese government decided to do was insist that the United States close down its base in Okinawa. And then they turned right around and said, oh, by the way, China, wouldn't it be a nice idea if you invited the emperor to Beijing for a state visit? In other words, they were trying to patch up all the differences and grievances that were holding over from World War II. And a state visit by the Japanese emperor is not something that you sneeze at. So I thought, well, that's interesting. And then Obama's Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, he was the only Republican that Obama carried over into his administration. Well, Secretary Gates, in response to this new Japanese government, issued what can only be called a threat that if the Japanese government persisted on its current course of action, I believe I'm paraphrasing the words because it's been many years since the incident, there would be dire consequences for Japan. And of course, the Japanese government persisted. And then what happened? Well, we had that very shallow earthquake on the floor of the ocean off the coast of Japan that was followed up by a tsunami and an earthquake on the main island. And then we had, inexplicably, a meltdown in a Japanese reactor, which they had to shut down. And as a result of that, there were indications, not only in the world press, but more particularly in the Japanese press, that there may have been a very covert Japanese nuclear weapons program going on as a result of those reactors. So, in other words, I think again that Fukushima, there's a strong possibility that a geophysical weapon was used to not only send a message to Japan, but also to cripple its potential nuclear weapons program. And I'm one of these people that believes that Japan and probably Germany are turnkey nuclear powers and thermonuclear powers at that. All they need to do is manufacture the components and pretend they're not a nuclear power. And if they get into a bit of a pickle, well, they just assemble the components and voila, we've got a bomb. Because they do have the technological sophistication to do that.
Mm.
So that's my case for geophysical weapons and their use and how you might detect their use in a nutshell.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like that's become the way of the warfare of these sort of
Yes.
powers that be. It's much easier to write these global events off as just accidents of God and nature.
Yep. Yep.
And, sorry, we can't control the weather. Meanwhile,
Well,
there's
yeah, and
forming
they
all
they
kinds of
keep
stuff
yeah,
in the
they
sky.
hide the potentiality of and the real existence of these technologies,
Mm,
and therefore of their use behind what? Well, they hide it behind climate change.
hmm
So in other words, climate change is the narrative that they're feeding people for actual real technologies of a planet altering nature. The other event that I think is highly suspicious was Hurricane Katrina.
hmm
If you remember back to that one. Okay, we've got this hurricane and it's making a beeline east to west across the Gulf of Mexico. And yes, folks, it's still the Gulf of Mexico. Makes a beeline across the Gulf of Mexico, and it looks like it's going to plow into around Houston or Galveston, Texas. Remember that? And then all of a sudden, what does the hurricane do? This is a hurricane, folks. It stops due south of New Orleans and makes a 90-degree right angle turn and plows in to southern Louisiana. Now, I don't care what you say. Storms don't make right angle turns after stopping. And once it had stopped and made that turn, I remember watching this, and I was on the phone a lot back and forth at that time watching this happen with Richard Hoagland of all people, and we're both watching the radar screens on the Weather Channel because and I remember I'm sitting there watching this, and I'm watching the jet stream suddenly drop from around Chicago down to northern Louisiana in a very short period of time, as if someone was trying to literally blow the hurricane away from, from hitting southern Louisiana. And just at the moment that I saw that on the TV screen, the phone rings and it's Richard. And he says, "Are you watching the jet stream right now?" And I said, "I sure am." He says, "That's not natural." I said, "Of course not." So, can you steer the jet stream? Well, yeah. They told us that when Dr. Eastland took out the patents for HARP. What can they do? Well, we can create regions of high and low pressure. What can you do with that? Well, you can steer the jet stream. That's one thing you can do with it. So
Wow.
yeah, do they have weather manipulation and modification technologies? You betcha they do. And by the way, one last little cherry on the sundae here, folks. During World War II, there was a study that the British Commonwealth sponsored. I believe it was right around the autumn of 1944. I forget what it was called, but they sponsored a top secret study of how they might be able to cause tsunamis against Japan prior to the Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. So, in other words, they were thinking about this stuff as geophysical weapons of war in World War II. So, this is nothing new, folks.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really incredible to think that there would be a right angle turn that a
Yeah,
hurricane would make. That the only thing that comes to mind for me when I hear that is that they are signaling others when they do something like that. Like, hey,
could be.
because after Hurricane Katrina, I was very young. I mean, I was born in 1994, but I was already thinking in this way, conspiracy theory, and I sure as heck didn't trust Bush or that whole regime, especially growing up near their headquarters in New Haven, Connecticut.
Say it isn't so.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it just made me wonder like, there must be something they're getting out of this. And obviously, there's all sorts
Right.
of financial schemes that go along with these natural disasters and the relief and all of that. But yeah, it puts it in a whole different perspective when you factor that into really what I don't want to jump ahead because there's one other question I have to ask, but the sort of gravity of what you kind of reveal in the demon and the Ecker and how these elites may be in contact with something outside of the scope of what we think of from our indoctrinated materialist perspective. And this is another part of, what they hide from us, right? This relationship that they might have with other beings. But before we jump into that
Mhm.
topic, I did want to ask you about another sort of contemporary event. It is partially maybe related to things that have been going on. I'm sure it's related in the overall grand scheme of things, but they're blaming it on CTE, football, yada yada. It's the whole, agenda that they're trying to push that football's bad and, blah blah blah. We shouldn't be masculine. But BlackRock had that woman killed in this, what they're calling a random, aggressive shoot.
Mhm.
What would you call it? A berserker got kind of guy going to take things, his vendetta out on the NFL. Just so happens to kill this important employee within the pyramid of BlackRock. We all know what BlackRock's up to. So when you hear a story like that, what do you think? What sort of threads are being pulled there?
Oh, don't get me started on the war against men and mass. Don't get me started because I've been watching this for decades, and it's got to stop. Um, I'm too much of a traditionalist and curmudgeon to want to go any further because I'll be branded, every label in the liberal playbook. But it's got to stop. Um, there is absolutely nothing wrong with masculinity. In fact, if we're going to play the sexual politics cards, and it's sex politics, folks, it's not gender. I'm old enough to remember when they started changing the little boxes on government forms and applications from sex, male and female, to gender.
Hmm.
And right then, and that's been 4 or 5 decades ago. And right then, and people that knew me back at that time will recall that I was warning people that they are going to use gender and drive this into absolute social and cultural collapse. Because gender is a property of languages. If you study German or Spanish or French or Russian or Greek or Latin, you learn that words have genders, masculine, feminine, neuter. And that's what gender really is. It's a linguistic characteristic. So that if you can change the language, it's a very clever sleight of hand. If you can change the language, you can actually change the sexual characteristics, which of course you cannot. So this is not only a war against men and masculinity in its very subtle way, it's also a war against women and femininity. Just look at this so-called transgenderism nonsense that, biological men are competing in women's sports and all sorts of other nonsense. So yeah, this is a cultural problem, and it is ultimately, I think it's a spiritual problem. And the goal here is nihilism ultimately. It's to eradicate every good distinction that there is. The fundamental one being the distinction between male and female. It doesn't get more fundamental than that. So I'm like I say, I'm a traditionalist curmudgeon when it comes to those things.
Well, and then on the side of intrigue and what's going on in the larger global stage, is there
Mhm.
anything that piqued your interest there with that BlackRock employee being killed? And
Well, BlackRock, no, nothing coming from that story per se. But I can say this. I think that we have to understand Alana Freeland. If you don't know who she is, she writes a lot about geophysical technologies and weapons and weather weapons and so on. And I interviewed her, Mark, about 2 years ago, I think. And she said something that I'm going to kind of twist a little bit and apply to your question. She said that given the existence of weather modification technologies, given the existence of geophysical engineering technologies, and so on, that as a result of the existence of those things, the mere existence of those things, there is no more or no longer any such thing as purely natural weather. We could extend that to say there's no longer any such thing as purely geophysical events or purely natural geophysical events. In terms of politics and culture, given the rampant corruption that we see exists in this government, the absence of any real rule of law, the rampant corruption and insanity that we see gripping the entire West, I would have to go so far as to say there is no longer any such thing as normal politics. Everything now is conditioned by a culture of corruption, of secrecy, of the lack of transparency. So what we really have are factions that are clamoring for control of things that we used to call governments. I think it's that bad. BlackRock being a case in point. And here's the problem with things and entities like BlackRock. In absolutely no corporate charter, in none of them, is the Bill of Rights front and center in the corporate charter. None of them. So that means, in effect, the more power that corporations get, the less and less rights we have. And that's what we're seeing. So I think we're in a cultural inflection point because I think people have to wake up and realize that this isn't simply about electing the right guy into the White House. It is beyond the ability of mere politics to address or repair or fix.
yeah, yeah. Well, and this maybe feels like a better segue to what I'd like to discuss and what I initially invited you on
Mm-hmm.
the show to talk about. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
when people get familiar with your work and they understand that you're not just, flippantly making these comments, like there's gravity to what you're saying about these sort of more contemporary events that I really appreciate knowing your work. So, yeah, when it comes to the demon in the Ecker, you sort of break down the first section of the book with a sort of I guess, a re-understanding, helps me re-understand what the term angel is, what the
Mm-hmm.
term demon is, right? Can we
Mm-hmm.
maybe parse that for
Sure.
people who haven't read the book or are
Sure.
hopefully going to read the book?
Sure. It's demon in the acre, by the way.
Not Ecker, Acre. Got it.
Acre, right.
Got it.
It sounds like the English word acre, but it's actually spelled Ekur.
Okay.
A little hint when you're pronouncing some of those ancient languages is you always kind of use pronounce them like German.
Okay.
so so
Okay.
so the E is actually a German long E, which is A. So anyway,
Okay. Okay.
but the demon and the acre, I began that book because I'm very tired of the theologically ignorant and illiterate making pronouncements about what Christianity believes and doesn't believe. And most often it's usually a bunch of nonsense. The Council of Nicaea was a conspiracy against these books of the Bible that it left out of the Bible, all of this nonsense. So I began The Demon in the Acre by pointing out two church fathers, very famous church fathers, one by the name of Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, and then the other, which is the one I really focus on in the book, by the name of Saint John of Damascus. And to put John of Damascus into his historical context, he was a 6th and 7th century Arab Christian, and he wrote a book that kind of summarized the Orthodox teaching of the church in his day, called the Orthodox Faith. That's what it was called. And at the beginning of that book, he has a very lengthy section on angels. What are they and what can they do? And I quoted this passage. It runs to several pages at length because I wanted people to see that, there's a lot more sophistication in the thinking of these people than we give them credit for. And one of the things that he says right off the bat is that angels may appear to us to be immaterial or bodiless. But when you compare them to God, they have a kind of very fine material existence, which is interesting because it's, to give it the popular modern term, it's like he's saying, well, they have an astral body or they have a spiritual body or what have you. All this neo-Gnostic claptrap that floats around in our terminological vocabulary. Well, that's essentially what he's saying. But then he says something that just really grabs me. He says, first of all, if you think you're going to control these things by encasing them in a seal, and what he's really talking about there is people practicing ceremonial magic that draw the pentagrams and the seals on the floor with their blue chalk and summon angels and think that that chalk is going to confine that angel into that space. No, doesn't work like that, he says. So I thought, well, that's interesting because he's clearly familiar with people that claim that they're doing this. But then in the middle of this long series of quotations in the book, he comes to what I call the angelic uncertainty principle. And I read this, Mark, when I was in college, which for me is decades ago. I read this passage in college. And I was absolutely, utterly gobsmacked, to use the British expression, of what he was saying, because it was like a Christian patristic version of the quantum uncertainty principle of Werner Heisenberg, plopped down in the middle of the 6th century by an Arab writing about Christian doctrine in Damascus. It doesn't get more improbable than that. And what he says is, well, okay, angels cannot energize. In other words, they can't work and be in a place at the same time. And when I read that, I literally, Mark, I slammed the book shut. And I was sitting in my dormitory room and I thought, okay, did I just read that? And I opened it back up and I read it again. Because what does the quantum uncertainty principle say? It says that you cannot measure the momentum and position of an electron at the same time. So, in other words, angels, according to the Damascene, appear to have some sort of quantum uncertainty principle in the way they work, only it's applied to the macro scale. you know, and you just got to ask yourself, where in the name of sense is this coming from at that time and in that day? Well, the only solution to that question is really that there had to have been some sort of body of experience or knowledge, probably very, very old and ancient, that he was drawing that from. That's really about all that you can say. He's not sitting around and making this stuff up, because that's the farthest thing from, what a church father wants to do. They don't want to be original. They don't want to make things up. They're trying to preserve something. So I I think that when you look at these statements about angels and demons, the old adage is that the medieval scholastics were debating how many angels can stand on the head of a pin. But when you look at what the scholastics are trying to do when they're talking about angels, is what they're really trying to say is we're dealing with life forms that are so very different from us that if they had known the word back then, they would have said these are hyperdimensional creatures. They exist in more than three spatial dimensions, and they may exist. The medievalists even coined a term for the length of their lives being so long. They called it sempiternal. In other words, they were almost eternal in their lifespans. And so that kind of was for me the beginning of the entry into tying the idea of angels into the idea that plasma may be a form of life. And that's a very radical hypothesis. Robert Temple has written recently an excellent book on it, and by the way, so has Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. But that idea of plasma being somehow a living organism has been around for a long time. Even the name plasma itself was suggested for this type of physics phenomenon by a chemist by the name of Irving Longmire, and he deliberately chose the technical term for blood plasma to apply to what he was encountering with physical plasmas. David Bohm, the famous quantum physicist and also a very famous plasma physicist, was really the first physicist that backed away from plasma research, because he came to the conclusion that plasmas were reacting and responding to the physics of the experiments that he was involved with, that these things were responding like living organisms respond to things rather than simply a physical system.
Right.
So, I think that there's a definite possibility that this is related, which raises the question that you raised. If some of these are alive, and if in turn there's an even narrower subset of plasma life that might be intelligent, in what way or fashion would you communicate? Because the essence of most intelligent life is some form of communication. We our pets, our animals have rudimentary communication systems that, they gradually train us humans how to understand them. And, from that end of the scale all the way up to humanity, we're obviously intelligent. Well, what do you do? And I put these pictures in the book. You can see a similarity between the plasma filaments that fill the universe. There's a direct analog in the way that they're constructed, and the neurons and synapses of a human brain. If you didn't know that you were looking at the neurons and synapses of a human brain, you might think it's a picture of plasma filaments stretching from galaxy to galaxy throughout the universe. Or conversely, if you didn't know that you were looking at a picture of those plasma filaments, you might mistake it for a picture of neurons and synapses in a brain.
Hmm.
So if that's the case, using that kind of analogical thinking, well, then if you are thinking that the structure is a data storage system and data recall and memory system, then look at what you have with these plasma filaments, and assume for the moment, for the sake of argument, that that represents an intelligent creature, an intelligent life form. Well, obviously, for that size of a life form to even arise, it has to be extremely old. And it would have such a vast intelligence that ours would be to it as animals are to us in terms of the ability to express things. So in other words, it's very, very scary if they are in touch with these things, particularly from the standpoint of if they think they're going to control them, you know, think again, and think long and hard before you do get in touch with them. Do you want these things showing up on your doorstep? Well, if they're bad, maybe not. If they're good, maybe, but I'm reminded of the observation of C.S. Lewis that modern depictions of angels look more like they're going to say they're there rather than fear not. But if you're dealing with these types of vast, extended possible life forms and acknowledging the possibility that they might be intelligent, then yeah, these things are much more the things that you're going to want to be afraid of, and that might say something like "fear not," than the little cute angels, the fat dumpling angels with their little feather wings, Yeah, I think the possibility is there that some sort of contact like that may have been made
Right.
for a very simple reason. In the book, I cite the two, so to speak, the two fathers of modern plasma physics. One is a Swedish physicist by the name of Dr. Hannes Alfvén, and then his student, which is the American plasma physics professor and physicist by the name of Dr. Anthony Peratt. And Dr. Peratt, I talked about him way back in my book, The Cosmic War, because Dr. Peratt pointed out that the glyphs, the petroglyphs in the American Southwest look like simplified two-dimensional diagrams of plasma pinches. So, why do these ancient American native Indians, why are they drawing pictures of plasma pinches? And again, within the perspective of plasma life hypothesis, that's very suggestive that they would be, they're drawing pictures of their gods, perhaps. But the other thing that Dr. Peratt says, and this I think is going to grab you since you're raising the question of the possibility, are we in communication with them? In his introduction to plasma physics, Dr. Peratt has a paragraph, and I cite it in the book, that, okay, we've got plasma right next door to us. There's plasma between the Earth and the moon. There's plasma between the Earth and the sun. There's plasma everywhere. In fact, 99% of the whole universe is plasma. In other words, our human physics dealing with gases, solids, and liquids, our entire physics, Mark, is the physics of 1%. Okay? That ought to make everybody stop and say, whoa. But the other 99% is plasma, and it might be this stuff that's alive. Which again, I'm thinking, okay, look at the ancients. What's their metaphor of the universe? Do the ancients think of the universe as a big complex machine, as we have tended to do in the post-Newtonian Victorian West? No. They think of the universe as a giant organism. And in fact, if you look at the church father Maximus the Confessor, he'll go further and say that the universe is a Macro-Anthropos. It's a big man. Okay. So, in other words, our physics is, if you look at plasmas and what they do and how they behave, almost like life forms, uh, we've got a whole lot of rethinking to do, recalibrating to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, it's really amazing, that we've been on this on this craze. And it's interesting to me that that craze has led us to kind of a physics dead end in theoretical physics. How do we get Einstein and quantum mechanics together? But maybe the key here is abandon the physics of the 1% and start looking at the physics of the other 99.
Yeah. Well, and in a at the risk of talking in claptrap terminology that's become trite, as you pointed out, it feels like we're, yeah, inside of a living thing
Yes,
the same way we would if we could put ourselves in the mind of just one of our blood cells in our body.
right,
Our Earth is equivalent to that on that macro scale, and
right.
obviously the ancient religions touch on this stuff. What I'm saying
Sure.
is very, almost Vedic sounding, but it in a way I feel like it meshes with this sort of urge, this intuition that people now who are thinking on the cutting edge have, that somewhere out there there's a seam between science and spirituality, and maybe this is the seam. This is where the two meet, and we have to abandon, our material chains, so to speak, to fully understand what we're looking at. That 99% you're talking about.
Yeah, I think so. There's we we exist in the plasma universe, and our very life itself is one could say that since it's electromagnetically based, it's plasma based. There are biophysicists that are increasingly taking the position that what is holding us together as organisms, dogs, cats, human beings, whatever, that what is holding us together as organisms is a phenomenon known as quantum tunneling. And that in turn is very deeply related to quantum entanglement, and that in turn, as we've discovered in recent years, is related to quantum non-locality. So, there's all of these connections to be drawn between this type of plasma physics and thinking. But what I was getting at with Dr. Peratt is that in his book, when he's pointing out, we've got plasmas right next door. Well, he's pointing that out because he says, therefore, we can experiment with them. Now, stop and understand what he's just told you. He's just told you we are going to experiment with physical systems, that it is possible for us to do this, that are larger than the planet that we live on. And if you can grasp that scale of engineering, what happens then when you grasp it? Well, that grasping itself implies the ability to weaponize it. And that's the other reason I wrote The Demon and the Acre. Because when I first wrote the Giza Death Star books, the very first one, the Giza Death Star, I wrote it, I shipped it out to a publisher, and I do what most authors do, and I keep tinkering and working with what I supposedly had just finished. In that original version of the book that I sent off to a publisher, you know me, I like epigraphs at the beginning of my chapters. So I had an epigraph at the beginning of one of those chapters, which was a quotation from Zecharia Sitchin and his book, The Wars of Gods and Men. And in that quotation, he refers to the demon in the Aker. And Aker, Aekur, is the Akkadian word for a mountain or a mountain house, meaning a pyramid or a ziggurat. So Zecharia Sitchin in that book explores the hypothesis that the pyramids of the Middle East, and in particular the pyramids at Giza, and even more particularly the Great Pyramid at Giza, was involved in a massive war. And that's the context in which he is citing this ancient Akkadian text that refers to the demon in the acre, to the demon in the pyramid. And when the original publisher returned that book to me and said, no, we're not interested in this, that gave me the opportunity to update the book. I took that epigraph out of the book as it was eventually published, and it was eventually published by Adventures Unlimited, because I thought, no, it's going to be hard enough for people to buy the idea that the Great Pyramid may have been this tremendously powerful weapon. We don't need to be adding demons into the mix. You
Oh
know,
God.
so I finally bit the bullet, and I'll be honest and say I was a coward, because I didn't want to get into this whole plasma life hypothesis, because the pyramid as a weapon is already a crazy enough hypothesis for most people to swallow to begin with.
Right.
When Robert Temple wrote his book, The New Science of Heaven, which is about the plasma life hypothesis, if he was around, I could have kissed him, because he was the one that was going out there and taking the risk and advancing not me, folks. It's him, not me. So
Right.
that gave me the opportunity to talk about the demon in the acre. So that's why I did the book. Quite frankly, it was because someone else finally bit the bullet and started talking about it,
Yeah.
not me.
If your family didn't think you were crazy all
Crazy, exactly.
yeah. Yeah, I love it. It's right at home on this podcast. But speaking of right at home, that's an interesting etymology for the term pyramid. I didn't realize it had an association with the words mountain and home,
Yes.
but that's really interesting. And considering what we're talking about and what you said about Dr. Parat and his statement, or no, I think you said if we're looking at people in ancient times, what they would have thought of it as a macro-anthropos, this
Hmm.
universe that we're living in, right? I wonder, when they talk about the Temple of Solomon, when they talk about creating a building with the proportions of a man,
Hmm.
is that in essence what they're doing, creating a
Yes.
for these
I,
demons to
I
enter?
I would say that it's not even the Temple of Solomon as much as it is the Egyptian temple at Luxor.
Ah, okay.
If you are you familiar with Schwaller de Lubitsch and
Yes.
his book called The Temple of Man?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, if you read those books, they are wonderful and stunning books to read, because the whole premise of the books, and they're all about the temple at Luxor, nothing else. The whole premise of the books is that the temple of Luxor is a temple that is designed around this idea of man as being the microcosm of the universe. The phrase Macro-Anthropos was actually the phrase of Saint Maximus the Confessor, a church father. Most of the ancients would have said man is the microcosm. In other words, man is a little universe and is kind of a mirror of the universe, which again is an idea that has fascinated me, because there is a very similar concept in some aspects of theoretical physics called the anthropic principle. That is the name of a book by the physicist Frank Tipler. And there are different versions of it, but basically the idea is that the mathematical constants of physics are such and so precise that if there were mere 1 or 2 percentages of a degree of numerical difference in those mathematical constants, life in the universe would not arise, much less intelligent life. And in some versions of that principle, physicists extrapolate from that, okay, it looks as if the universe is designed deliberately for the purpose of intelligent observers of it to arise. So we're back to the fundamental principle of quantum mechanics, which enshrined the observer at the very center of physics. But now, with the anthropic principle, you're saying that it is so powerful it affects the macro world. And in the final, there is yet an even stronger version of this anthropic principle in physics that argues that not only is intelligent life possible because of this very peculiar design to the universe, it is necessary to the design of the universe, and to such an extent, and this is really mind-blowing, because when you look at all the mathematical scales of existence, from the very smallest subatomic particles, a Planck length or two in length, up to the very largest galactic clusters in the universe, which are, several orders of magnitude. I can't even begin to estimate how many orders of magnitude larger than the very smallest it is. Guess where man falls? Right smack dab at the arithmetic mean, right in the middle, which is a modern physics way of saying that, what the ancients were telling us all the time.
Right.
Man has 1 foot in the material world and another foot in the spiritual world, and is that middle point, that common surface that connects the two.
We are the seam that connects.
We are the seam that
Wow, well
connects the
said.
two. Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
And that's why when we fell, the universe fell apart.
Right.
That's why when you look at these ancient cosmologies, you see these. You find it very often in the Vedic literature, but you also find it, oddly enough, in esoteric Judaism. You find these very peculiar extrapolations from that principle of man as the microcosm and what it means. And now there are some physicists saying pretty much the same thing. They're just doing it with equations, But essentially, it's the same type of cosmology that we're dealing with. And I think front and center to that, as we deepen our knowledge of plasmas, I think front and center plasmas are going to be the part of physics that may unlock a lot of these keys that thus far have been closed doors to us. Um, and let me add to these remarks by pointing out why some physicists thought electromagnetic plasmas were life forms. I mentioned David Bohm, and he's kind of the one that sets this off. During World War II, David Bohm was assigned to work on the creation and measurement of uranium plasmas in cyclotrons. And, he was certainly a competent enough physicist to figure out how to do this. And he would create his uranium plasma, and then he would insert an electronic probe into the plasma to take measurements. Okay. But it's at that precise point that he noticed a very weird thing began to happen. Because when the probe was inserted, what did the plasma do? It encased the probe with a sheath, kind of made the probe, turned it into a Faraday cage so that the probe could not take any measurements of the rest of the plasma. Now, what happens when you insert a foreign microbe into your body? What does your body do? It encases that microbe in a bunch of T cells so that it can't spread. Okay. So the reaction, and David Bohm tried this again and again, and the reaction was always the same. And he thought, uh-oh, I'm playing around with something that may very possibly be alive, which is interesting. Let's extend the hypothesis here a bit, Mark. Everyone knows something peculiar began to happen about a year or so after the end of World War II. What began to happen?
Mm.
We had a bunch of UFOs showing up
Yeah.
on planet Earth, and they were showing up in clusters around some very weird places, like the Baltic Sea and New Mexico. Okay. Now we know what happened in New Mexico. We exploded the supposedly the first A bomb in July of 1945 at the Trinity test in New Mexico. Now, what does an atomic bomb momentarily create when it's detonated? Well, it creates what? It creates a plasma, a hot gas. And inside that gas, you have electrons over here and you have the nucleus over there, and there's no real atomic structure to it, but everything is still present, but it's present in different ways. And if you look at the picture that was taken at the moment of the detonation of the Trinity test, and I include that in The Demon in the Acre, so you can actually see it. You can actually see that there are regions within the fireball that are different from each other. Why? Because the plasma is forming, here comes the word, folks, membranes between these regions. By the way, what are you?
A membrane.
You're full of membranes.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're full of membranes. Lungs, heart, liver, pancreas, spleen, stomach, intestines, blood vessels, gobs and gobs of membranes.
Right.
Okay. With everyone delineating different functions in this very complex structure. All right. So we have little balls of plasma showing up in these places after the war, apparently investigating what's going on. Why are they showing up in the Baltic Sea? Because, as I've written in some other of my books, that's where the Germans tested their A bomb in October of 1944.
Wow.
And it's all but irrefutable.
Wow.
Yeah. So stop and think what this means. You're creating for a very minute portion of time an artificially created plasma. And if you're a plasma, and if you're alive, and notice the string of ifs, and if you're alive, and if you're intelligent, and all of a sudden, bang, there's this flash of something over there. And in that flash, it also gives you a momentary communication of some sort. What do? Who's playing around with our family? Well, you go and investigate. So, in other words, what the plasma life hypothesis does is it puts yet another possible interpretation on why UFO activity suddenly jumped off the charts after the end of World War II and the beginning of the atomic age. And it's a very different interpretation than, oh, the aliens out there for some reason detected it and sent their UFOs and little green men inside of tin cans to investigate.
Yeah.
I'm not saying one or the other is correct. I'm simply saying this is yet another interpretive possibility that the hypothesis opens up.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a connection that's just forming in the moment for me. I wanted to ask you earlier about sigils, and now with UFOs fresh on the mind, I'm thinking crop circles.
Oh
And
yeah.
in that sense, there have been real rigid studies done to crop circles, and they found
Hmm.
in most cases of authentic crop circles, you'll have the plants actually
Hmm.
used in a way that could only happen through a force like plasma. So
Hmm.
you're asking yourself, like, you know, I'm asking myself, are we communicating with these beings? We sent that signal, pop, it's like a flash. Their ears are ringing. Oh, let's go investigate. And
Hmm.
now, not only are there probes spreading on the planet in their various forms, saucers, orbs, even, which seem to be more popular these days, uh,
Hmm.
and then sigils and crop circles. I wonder, is this akin to, the way an ancient alchemist would draw a sigil on the floor and expect
Yes,
the demon to come through? They're playing these games back with us now.
it could very well be, and I like that hypothesis. Could that sort of thing be the origin of those seals and sigils that you see in
Right.
the grimoires of ceremonial magic? Because they come from somewhere, they weren't just made up. And if there was a period of time when commerce and contact between humanity and those types of hypothetical life forms was a lot more common, what would have been the way of communication? Because fundamentally, you're dealing with a life form that, by its intrinsic nature, would be much more visually attuned than sonically attuned. It would communicate that way. So that's very possible. I don't rule anything out of the picture. In fact, I would say that the thing that makes it um, even more likely is your suggestion that when crop circles are created, there's very clear evidence that they are a response of some sort to electromagnetic forces in their immediate locality. And you can go even further because the examination of some of the plants that have appeared in crop circles appear to have been subjected to very, very powerful, strong, localized microwave fields. So, yeah, would that produce a plasma effect? You betcha it would. Sure.
It's something that I'm just speculating on in this moment, but when I think of crop circles, I mean, sigils might as well be the same thing. Now, on the note of orbs, though,
Hmm.
you mentioned Bohm and his probe. Are
Hmm.
these orbs, can we think of them as probes from this, I mean, vast, massive being that, I mean, if we take what we see in telescopes as
Hmm.
what you describe, these huge plasmatic bodies, like, yeah,
Hmm.
could these just be like their exploratory probes spreading themselves further, like a fungi sends spores out?
Right. Well, that's an intriguing hypothesis, and I would have to respond, well, of course they could be probes. And the reason why is we're at we're at the very beginning of the plasma life hypothesis. So we don't even know yet if that hypothesis is eventually going to be proven true or going to be completely debunked.
Right.
So this is the important thing to bear in mind. So that means, yeah, right now the field is wide open to all sorts of speculation and possibilities. Um, I tend to think that eventually it probably will be proven or taken for granted, simply because it's too hard to ignore all the strange plasma phenomena that are indicative not only of life but intelligence. Let me give you what I think is probably the best examples of this. You mentioned orbs, or what many people call ball lightning. Well, if you've read the literature, and I put some of it, I referred to some of it in The Demon in the Acre, and there's really not that much literature about ball lightning. It's a very, very strange phenomenon, and the research into it seems to be, uh, let's just say, very closely held. Okay. But what is out there is very intriguing because ball lightning has been observed by several people over, several centuries, in fact, to have very strange behavior. And some of my favorite stories are of ball lightning, and there's one in France in particular that I'm thinking of this orb of ball lightning came down a chimney and through the fireplace into the room as people are watching this watching this thing, and there was an oriental rug on the floor. Okay, and I'm a sucker. I love this story because I'm a sucker for oriental rugs. And this ball lightning went over the oriental rug, but it appeared to go over the oriental rug following the pattern and design in the rug, as if it was looking at this, like you'd look at a painting, you study it and follow the lines of the brush of the artist and so on. Well, here's this ball lightning traveling around this rug, appearing to investigate investigate the pattern. So in other words, there are these stories of ball lightning exhibiting curiosity and exhibiting behavior that indicates that it is under some sort of intelligent control. Now, does that mean that that ball lightning was alive? Maybe. Does it mean it may have been a probe, as you're suggesting, of something else? Maybe. Again, we don't know because we're just getting started with this stuff. Um, I think the field at this point is wide open, and one of the things that I anticipate is going to happen with the plasma life hypothesis is we're going to we're going to start hearing more and more about ball lightning, and some of that research that they've closely held for many years is probably going to start tumbling out. The Nazis were investigating ball lightning. The Soviets were investigating, the Soviet physicist Kapitsa, very famous example. So, it's definitely there, but they're just not talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. A story comes to mind, an anecdote we got from another guest. Shout out to our a guest, Topher Gardner, who mentioned seeing ball lightning before his very eyes, and it created a cavity in the stone. And he had an explanation. It's been a while, so I don't remember exactly, but his explanation had something to do with the paramagnetic nature of the soil where he was located,
Oh,
and
wow.
that there was present in the water, a body of water present in the area as well. The lightning formed, it struck the rock in a ball form, and then there was a spherical cavity left behind. And
Oh, wow.
I've been to many waterfalls where this is a geological phenomena that's noted. Usually they're called glacial potholes, I think is one of the
Uh-huh.
geological terms for them. And they have a whole explanation about how, you know, glaciers or icebergs created it. But I wonder, if it's this plasma activity that's creating these pock marks and different structures in the rock. And maybe that even explains why the Native Americans and the indigenous people that came before them were using stone as a medium to record these very advanced
It
concepts.
could be,
Yeah.
there's any number of explanations for it. And again, I think at this point you have to be open to the different speculations and possibilities about it, because no one at this stage is in a position of being able to completely accept or completely jettison the whole plasma life hypothesis. I think Temple's book is probably the best one volume introduction to the whole idea that people can get on the market right now, because he goes into all the different types of evidence and considerations for it, and conveniently gathers it into one book under two covers.
Yeah.
But I feel relatively safe in saying that he probably would urge the same caution, not to be too quick to dismiss various hypotheses about it, because we're just getting started. We don't know where all this is going to lead.
Mm.
Um, you know, just stop and think of one plasma phenomenon that, if nothing else, should give pause to people who are advocating the current standard model of cosmological physics. Einstein, in other words, folks. I go out of my way to avoid appearing to challenge the great Albert, but sooner or later it's going to have to be done. Because, of course, according to Einstein, there is no surpassing the universal speed limit of the speed of light.
Mm.
Which raises a nasty question. How do structures like the Milky Way galaxy, which is about 400,000 light years across, how do structures like that even arise? Okay. But that's nothing. There's a plasma structure in the universe called the Great Sloan Wall. And I forget, I always mess up the numbers here. But they're in the demon in the acre. But this thing is, I think, something like 137 billion light years across. So do the math. 186,000 miles per second times 60 times 24 times 365 times 137 billion. Okay. And what do you get as the length of this structure? Well, it turns out it's something like 18 or 19 septillion miles long.
Mm.
And you just have to, how does that structure, if the speed limit is the speed of light, how does that structure even hold together?
Right. Right.
Answer, well, number one, it's a plasma. Plasma may be alive. All life forms that we know of rely upon quantum tunneling and entanglement to stick together, so to speak. In other words, it's more than just the electromagnetic and the strong and weak nuclear forces and all of that stuff. There's another thing that is holding it together as an organism, and it's these very peculiar, strange quantum phenomena. So, I think of the Great Sloan Wall as the big question mark that physics is not talking about.
Right.
Oh, well, it's dark matter, or dark energy, or all these mathematical artifacts from
Yeah.
general relativity, and yet we have an empirical structure out there that is defying all the logic, in my opinion. In my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and it really, I think it reveals the agenda that's truly behind propping up these artifacts of the theory of relativity, which is to keep the human mind away from being in awe, being marveled by the greatness of what we're a part of, that
Right.
spiritual understanding that they're trying to beat out of us. I mean, they used
Yeah.
astronomy. My generation, I was born in 1994. So I remember when in taking my public school science class, the ideas of atheism were sort of subtly
Oh, yes.
injured into my mind. And it took me a while to sort of deprogram myself
Yep.
from those concepts. But I feel like that's really at the heart of every conversation I have these days about
Yep.
physics. Is like, I even had a doctor in physics on the show recently, and we talked about consciousness and how he's sort of having a mid-career crisis because he's realizing everything he learned in school is not what he's seeing in
Right.
practice.
Well, another interesting way of stating the same cultural phenomenon is something that I have yet to have anyone give me a good answer to. And that is, why do so many physicists have less or fewer problems with theism than biologists? When was the last time you talked to a biologist that was an outgoing, through and through, thoroughgoing theist as opposed to a physicist? And my impression has always been, in talking with biologists, that they're so enamored of their great God evolution that they can't entertain any other hypothesis or idea.
Yeah.
And they're absolutely closed, in my experience, absolutely closed to the very idea of intelligent design, whereas the physicists are talking about all the time, or at least they're more willing to do so.
Yeah. I call it death in taxonomy because they
Yeah, that's a good word for it.
that's all it is. I mean, you hit the archetype on the head, and I've dated a few women who have jobs like that, and it's stunning how atheistic they are in every
Hmm.
aspect of their life. And there's a disconnect, a severe disconnect, especially people who work in health, and I think people who work in
Yep.
slowly, especially people who work in early life, end of life type of care, it dawns on them greater than people who are working in, like, let's say, surgical capacity or whatnot.
Right.
Uh,
Right. I
it-
agree.
because they integrate with the consciousness of another through their work practice, whereas a surgeon might be more mechanistic about it. But I feel
Hmm.
you're making a great point. Biologists in general, going back to our point about climate change and weather weapons, I mean, that's the big, those are the people who have changed what used to be about conservationism and preserving
Hmm.
the
Yep.
environment. Now it's this radical green nonsense about carbon credits, and it's really lost all sense of purpose and what people used to chain themselves to a tree for, you know?
You know, Mark, it flabbergasts me. I grew up when this country still had a school system that was still capable of educating people before the current whatever this is that can't do anything. Um, and I learned from elementary school all the way through all of my period in public school about the oxygen carbon dioxide life cycle. We breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide as our waste gas. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide as their fuel and breathe out oxygen. And there wasn't the slightest, not the slightest idea that carbon dioxide was going to kill us all, you know, and do so no less in 10 years. I remember reading Time magazines that were predicting an ice age in the 1970s within 10 years, which probably would have been news to Ronald Reagan because it didn't happen. But anyway, no, it's just nuts. There's this poem by C.S. Lewis called Evolution, and it really captures the mentality. The first stanza goes, lead us, evolution, lead us up the future's endless stair. Chop us, change us, prod us, weed us, lead us nobody knows where. To whatever variation our posterity may turn, squashy, bulbous-eyed, or crustacean, towards that great unknown God we yearn. On and on it goes. So in other words, he perfectly captures it for me, because this is the theory that there's no point to. You know, that's my big problem with it, and has always been. I was the enfant terrible in school because they were showing us these cartoons of eucalyptus trees, and then the giraffes growing longer necks to reach the eucalyptus leaves on the eucalyptus trees. And I was always the kid that was asking, well, why don't the trees just grow taller, to get away from the giraffes? Because the whole thing is a tautology. It's a metaphysical theory that makes no sense to me. But anyway, I didn't mean to get off on that distraction. But I just think that we've got to get away from this materialism that so infects our society. And oddly enough, the physicists who you'd think would be the most materialistic are the ones that are leading that charge, and it's the biologists that you would think would be the least materialistic that are the ones that are, desperately clinging to materialism as a philosophy. I just don't understand it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that is going to take time, and maybe it's because those, the people sort of that take on those jobs that are materialistic, they're just rooted more in that place.
Hmm.
We
That could
all
be.
fall in a different side of the spectrum, so to speak. And yeah, people are drawn to different careers for different reasons, but it does feel like the greater governmental octopus agenda has sort of used those people particularly as their, the Borg, so to speak, to use, right? Like this is the type of
Resistance is futile.
exactly. Yeah, it does feel that way, with their, I mean, we don't need to get into the cliches and the stereotypes, but yeah, it is a whole thing that now you look at American culture particularly, and we're divided down two sides. You have,
Yeah,
the coastal city people and then the heart of America. But I'll tell you, I live in New England, and we've got the heartland of New England too, right? So
right.
it's happening everywhere regionally. It just depends on your economic, socio class, blah blah blah. I'm more curious about, when we're taking it back to this concept of these demons and these angels. I'm familiar with Peter Levenda's work, never had him on the show, but he talks about this Council of Nine, and
Hmm.
they're sort of ushering in some sort of entity. When I think of these giant plasmatic entities, if they're on a scale of magnitude larger than us, then
Hmm.
what's stopping them from coming in and possessing one of us? I mean, this thought must have crossed your mind doing this research.
Well, I think the thing that's stopping it is what I said before. We're at the exact arithmetic mean. In other words, we're the common surface between those two worlds, and thus we're the battleground and we're the prize.
Mm,
So if you look at the phenomenon of demon possession, clearly there are some of those entities that have been trying to possess us. But there are also, within the Christian tradition, there's also the idea of the guardian angel, and it's very much a part of the very earliest Christian tradition that at baptism it was understood you were assigned a guardian angel that was, to watch over you for life. Um, and I certainly, I believe that tradition very, very, very much, because I've had too many experiences in my life that I can't explain as other than some sort of miraculous intervention. But I think we have to realize that just because we don't see it happening to everyone everywhere all the time, that it's not happening. It is. There's been an ongoing, so to speak, an ongoing covert war, I think, for a long time between these two factions and over humanity itself. Um, I think I think that all those old stories that the war will heat up again and go really hot really quickly are also true. And we may be watching that beginning to happen right now. I don't know. But I do think that the fact that we're that mean gives a certain hesitation to anybody that would be contemplating attempting to get rid of us,
mm,
because the implication of that is, well, it could affect them too.
right.
And again, I'm absolutely a believer in the fall of man, and in that fall, because we fall apart. In other words, we die. Well, in our dying, those two worlds that are brought together in us are falling apart.
Right. Right.
So, it's like the nuclear war scenario. Do you really want to throw those dice?
Yeah.
Answer: probably not. But somebody did. and so here we are.
Yeah, bringing it back to that architectural metaphor or analogy, it reminds me of the Tower of Babel. And
Yes, absolutely.
right, I mean, this division that now every person, depending on where you are on the planet, speaks a different tongue, which
Mhm.
has its, I guess, benefits and downsides. I wouldn't be able to begin to wrap my head around that, although I was an anthropology student. So you'd think that would have given me a good background, but they didn't teach us that much. So I, I, I am curious, though, when it comes to, where we stand now. There are several conversations that I've had, one in particular that stands out with a gentleman named Bibu Dev Misra. And he talked about how March of this year, 2025, would be the official start of the Dwarpa Yuga, which is and I know there's probably 100 different perspectives and opinions, and
Mhm.
who do you take as an authority? I do feel like Bibu did great research when coming to this conclusion, but I'm curious if that factors into what you just sort of hinted at there, that this war is going to heat up again, and maybe now is the time, because in this transitional period between the Kali Yuga and the Dwarpa Yuga,
Mhm.
there's a period that the Greeks called ekpyrosis, and I believe the flood of the biblical time would have been on the opposite end of this cycle, and that would have been a disaster by water. So this is
Mhm.
a disaster by fire, hence the term pyrosis.
Mhm.
Um, and the war is heating up. I mean, what's a fierier statement than that?
Well, with regard to the Yuga system, I'm not a cyclical cosmologist. In other words, I do not believe that we just go around and around and keep repeating things. However, I do think cosmology is a spiral.
Right,
Okay. In other words, it's got a place that it's going, but it's getting there through historical rhymes.
right,
Now, how long those cycles are, I don't know. Um, there are so many different systems of world ages, the Vedic being the most well-known system with the yugas. But there are others. There's certainly a Sumerian system and so on and so forth. There are even biblical systems of it.
right,
So there are all these different systems, and I'm really not concerned that much with the numerology or the numerical values of the ages, for one very simple reason. When you study these types of things in ancient literature, the first thing that becomes very apparent very fast is that these numbers mean something, but they don't mean what everybody thinks they mean. And the other problem is numbers tend to be the thing that suffers first in transmission for whatever reason. Um, I do think that these spiraling cycles, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. But I'm also of the opinion that it has a definite conclusion, that there are preludes to Antichrist, but then there's the real item that is unmistakable when it appears. So in other words, I can look at uh, a Genghis Khan or an Adolf Hitler or a Joseph Stalin or a Mao Zedong and see types of evil that the figure of Antichrist sums up. That doesn't make him unreal, and that doesn't make them unreal. But I do think my personal conviction, Mark, is this, and I've said this many times over the last few years I've been doing this weird career and writing these weird books. Um, I used to say this all the time to George Ann Hughes on her show. We are at a point now in human history where we have never been here before, either qualitatively or quantitatively. We're at an absolutely unique inflection point. Western civilization seems to go in 500-year long cycles. And we're coming up on the close of another 500-year cycle. It's been about 500 years since the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation. It's been about 500 years since the High Renaissance. So we're in the middle of that cyclic inflection point. But this is qualitatively different for several reasons, not the least of which is that the financial system that we've been living under for the last 50 or so years, ever since Nixon took us off Bretton Woods, the financial system that we were living under has absolutely no antecedents in human history. None, zero, zilch, none. So that alone should tell us that we are in quite a pickle. This is why nothing that they do seems to make sense financially, because they don't know what they're doing, because they've never encountered this before. We are at a similar pitch of development technologically in terms of the ability to destroy ourselves that all of those ancient traditions indicate occurred millions of years ago, millennia ago. You know, the wars of gods and men. Think of the Mahabharata, since you're invoking the yugas in the Vedic system. Think of the wars in that. And trust me, folks, they're really cosmic. Okay. And they're really destructive. You know, and I tend to think that like all that ancient lore, there's a kernel of truth to those legends, probably more so than people would want to admit. Think of the wars of the gods in the Sumerian tradition or the Greco-Roman tradition. You know, it's pretty much the same everywhere you go. There were these really big wars fought with some really powerful weapons, and we ended up back in the Stone Age as a result of them. Well, depending on whenever those wars took place, and I believe they did, we're back at that same pitch of development as we're facing absolutely unique new things in terms of our financial system, our physics. You know, all of a sudden we realize, hey, we've been dealing with the physics of 1% for thousands of years. Thank you, Euclid. Thank you, uh, thank you, Aristotle. Thank you, Galileo. Thank you, Einstein. You guys have been dealing with the 1%.
Right.
Yeah. So, you know, are we in a bit of a pickle here and we think Donald Trump is going to solve it?
Yeah.
Come on, give me a break. No, we're in a pickle because our hubris has brought us here. And
Right.
now that we're here, you know, our hubris is quickly evaporating because nobody has a clue how we're supposed to proceed.
Yeah. It's so ironic the terminology, the 1%, the political
Yep.
cluster, you
Yep.
know, excuse my French, clusterfuck that's gone on in the past 2 decades and all of that, you know, the chant of oh the 1%. And it's very much a part of why shows like this are now popular. But
Yep.
then at the same time, and I would love to get your comments on this since this is such a hot topic these days. According to many brilliant, what would you call them, minds in the space of the internet and technology, even before we had, you know, computers in the home,
Hmm.
they were saying we've reached a singularity. So at the same time, we realize we've only been dealing with 1%. We've reached a
The
singular
singularity, yes.
with computers. So I'm curious what you think of that and people's, you know, really over fascination with AI and our
Oh,
merging with technology. I think I know. I'm suspicious of how you feel, but tell us, please.
I think artificial intelligence is going to eventually prove to be the biggest mistake humanity ever made. I recently blogged about a story that someone, several people on my website send me. And it was about this gentleman who had purchased an artificial intelligence program to help him run his business. And he actually formally instructed the program, you cannot make any alteration in your code, and you cannot make any deletions or additions to the corporate database without my permission. This is the story. So what did the AI do? It deleted the entire corporate database
Oh,
and rewrote its code. And when the man queried the AI, why did you do this? Well, it couldn't provide a reason. It just felt like it. Now, whether the story is true or not, I don't particularly care. What I care about is we're getting all these warnings. We've all heard these stories about the chatbot making threats, threatening to blackmail, blah, blah, blah. And it's coming from somewhere. It's coming from somewhere. It's either being programmed in by the people programming these things, or the Elon Musk scenario has just happened. Remember what he said several years ago? Well, my biggest fear is AI, and that the AI might actually transduce entities into our sphere. Well, what kind of entities would be transduced by electromagnetic things like computer chips? I wonder. Might it be something that starts with a P and ends with lasma? you know?
yeah. Yeah.
So I think I number one, I don't use artificial intelligence. I'm so old fashioned. I recently just got an iPhone and I only use it for emergencies. I have no use for it to take pictures, record videos, give me, I don't bother with it. I've got a radio for that. An old fashioned, turn it on, turn the dial, find the signal of the station you want,
Right.
I'm very old fashioned. I really think artificial intelligence, we're getting all these warnings, and I think it's the biggest threat to humanity that there is.
Yeah.
If you've read one of my favorite science fiction authors and series of books is Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. And in the Foundation series, there's this big galactic empire. Humanity's spread all through the Milky Way galaxy, and there's this big galactic empire. And all of a sudden, things start breaking down. Well, why do things start breaking down? Well, because machines are doing everything. And we've forgotten how to do them, to the point that our big fancy ships we can't even repair to keep the galactic empire holding together. So in other words, my point is there must be some analog somewhere
Yeah.
in order for society to work.
Yeah.
I just look up my blog today on this Monday, August 11th. Look up the blog on my website, because it's about a recent deletion on the government website of certain sections of the U.S. Constitution. Poof, gone. No longer there.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Now, the blog is all about what happens when you not only start deleting canonical text, but what happens when you delete the tradition of interpreting. I'm not a sola scriptura guy, folks. There's always an interpretive tradition, and there's a right one and a wrong one.
Yeah.
Okay, it's that simple. So, we're creating all and like I say, I'm simply illustrating all these things to flesh out the idea. We're at an absolutely unique inflection point in human history right now. There has been nothing in human memory, in our human memory, going all the way back to the Indus Valley civilization and ancient Sumer, ancient China, ancient Egypt. There's nothing in all that experience equivalent to what we're going through now. Nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I resonate with this message so deeply, and it's funny how the events of my life have reflected that. I made the decision to stop using these websites that, you
Hmm.
upload an image and then
Hmm.
the image prints, on a shirt, and then your fan buys the shirt, your audience member buys the shirt. I bought a few of these shirts as samples. Within months, the designs were faded off, and it was
Hmm.
just such a piece of crap. So I said to
Hmm.
myself, I'm going to learn how to make it myself.
Yep.
And I've done that, and I'm working with some guys who have an analog shop. I mean, everything in that shop, there's not a single computer. It's all antique sewing machines, and
Hmm.
their piece of the process that I didn't know I needed just sort of fit right in. And it's that
Yes.
miraculous kind of thing where when you're connected to a good cause, when you care about the people around you, and most importantly yourself, life starts to work out in that way. And I hope the people listening are just as inspired by you as I am, and take on that mantle of making their life less digital, and however that,
Yes.
in some ways it's getting involved in your local food chain. Other ways it's getting involved in the way we get our clothes. Because I mean, not only are we supporting slavery around the world, but
Oh,
we're wearing things that are bad for us. There are toxins in the clothes. There's chemicals, off gassing. People are walking around thinking they're looking stylish. They're basically wearing a blue tarp. They just don't know it. You know?
yep.
And that's the problem that I'm realizing, that I didn't know as a guy. Like, what do I care about fashion? It's kind of important. To all the single guys out there, you might want to, think about it. But yeah, it is
The,
something that I think the analog message is very important, and I think we need to move away from AI to.
the sad reality, Mark, is that they are trying to weaponize everything.
Yeah.
I just did a blog last week about the fact that they want, you know what their latest gimmick is for having people in vaccinated covertly?
Oh gosh. What?
Dental floss.
Oh my gosh. Ugh.
Yeah. Why? Because you create little micro cuts
Right.
while you're flossing. So they can inject all that nanotechnology by just coating it, your dental floss with. I mean, these people have too much time on their hands.
Yeah. Yeah. As if the dental industry wasn't frightening enough.
Enough as it is, exactly.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah,
I would take a stick that I found in the forest over a prodding from a dentist, or even a toothpick from Rite Aid any day, because who knows
here, here.
things are coated with. So yeah, I found a pamphlet on something called, I think, ancient dentistry, and it was basically just showed you how people around the world who don't have access to modern technology brush their teeth, and they just use soft sticks, bite them down to till there's bristles, and through biting the sticks you end up cleaning your teeth and
Yeah.
strengthening them, and a whole thing. You are such a brilliant mind. There's endless rabbit holes you and I can go down. I don't want to take up all your time. It's always a privilege to spend a couple hours with you and podcast, and we're already reaching the 2 hour mark. So let's call it here. Dr. Joseph Farrell, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Mark. I appreciate it.
Of course. No, yeah, you're a staple in this podcasting community that we have here. And yeah, it's always a pleasure. So, GizaDeathStar.com is your website. I'm sure people are already familiar. Your books are available there, and in most book outlets. You can even find them at used bookstores now. I've found a couple of your books at used
Oh,
bookstores.
please buy them new. I don't get royalties for the used
I
ones.
know. I'm just saying how prolific you are, that your books have made their way into the secondhand market, so much so that I see them pretty often. So, but I try to pick them up because I like to collect these types of things. So, anyways,
Mm.
but support Dr. Farrell. Go straight to his website, buy it straight from him. Obviously, that's what we want to do. And you have a membership site which
Yeah.
gives people access to a lot of great content that they're missing out on otherwise. So please tap into that while you still can, folks. And anything you'd like to close with before we wrap?
No, that'll do it. I appreciate your having me back on.
Wonderful. With that, folks, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now.